forward. His legs commenced to settle. He swung from side to side, hesitated, and then went down on his knees. And Romero's older brother leaned forward behind him and drove a short knife into the bull's neck at the base of the horns. The bull went over, twitching and rigid. The brother cut the notched black ear of the bull and trotted with it over to Romero. The bull lay heavy and black on the sand, its tongue out. Boys were running toward him from all parts of the arena, making a little circle around him. They were starting to dance around the bull. Romero took the ear from his brother and, running to get ahead of the crowd, came toward us. He leaned up against the barrera and gave the ear to Brett. He nodded his head and smiled. The crowd were all about him. "You liked it," called Romero. Brett did not say anything. They looked at each other and smiled. Brett had the ear in her hand. The matador's killing of the bull is a great tragedy. And the whole ritual of it is the most beautiful thing that I've ever seen. And it takes more guts and skill and guts again than anything possibly could. It is like sitting at the ringside of the war, only nothing can happen to you. All stories, if continued far enough, end in death. And he is no true storyteller who would keep that from you. In 1932, I wrote Death in the Afternoon, my nonfiction work about bullfighting, in which I look at the ritual of bullfighting as emblematic of writing and of life in general. And the courage that bullfighters and bulls show in the ring is emblematic of all of my characters and the way they face death and defeat with grace under pressure. Santiago in The Old Man and the Sea, Robert Jordan in For Whom the Bell Tolls, and Frederick Henry and Catherine Barclay in A Farewell to Arms. Thank you. I look forward to answering your questions.
All right, at this point, if you have a question for Mr. Hemingway, would you please raise your hand and we'll come and bring a mic to you, and so everybody can hear and Mr. Hemingway can hear the question as well. Any questions?
One here.
I'll come over there next.
After you were wounded in the war and laying in the hospital, is that when you decided to start writing? What made you decide to become a writer?
I had actually been writing back in Oak Park, Illinois, where I grew up. I had been writing on the school newspaper, and then I seriously considered being a professional writer, but the kind of writers that I was emulating were writers like my neighbor in Oak Park, Edgar Rice Burroughs, who wrote the Tarzan books, and O. Henry and adventure stories. Rudyard Kipling was a favorite. So I liked adventure even as a kid, and I gravitated towards writing adventure stories when I started out. But it wasn't until I went to Paris. Well, and I went to Paris on the advice of the writer Sherwood Anderson, whom I'd known in Chicago. He gave me letters of introduction to Gertrude Stein and Ezra Pound and some other people in Paris, and that changed the kind of writing that I did. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question over here.
What happened to your relationship with Bumby after your marriage with Hadley ended?
Yes, Bumby was the nickname we gave to John Hadley Nicanor Hemingway. Well, he lived with his mother mostly, and in a few years she remarried. And but I stayed close to Bumby, mostly by taking him hunting and taking him with me on trips. When I married Pauline, my second wife, she became his stepmother. And then Martha became his next stepmother, and Mary became his next stepmother. And all of my wives, well, especially Martha, really tried to be a good mother to my three sons. I had two sons with Pauline, Patrick and Gregory.
Okay, Mr. Hemingway, to your right, far right.
I just wanted to know what were some of your earliest motivations for, the topics, or did that include your stint in the military, if it had an effect on you?
Well, my first major work is a collection of stories, very experimental, called In Our Time. And there were stories, and there were also interchapters, which were prose poems. I had started experimenting with these short prose poems under the influence of Gertrude Stein. They were, in some ways, writing exercises that Gertrude Stein gave me. And many of those dealt with my experiences in Italy. And interestingly, I actually started writing about bullfighting before I ever even saw a bullfight. But once I saw them, I wrote other stories about bullfighting. So among the stories in Our Time that I've mentioned earlier were Out of Season, that first story I wrote after losing everything, My Old Man, and Big Two-Hearted River. Big Two-Hearted River is the last story of that collection. And that's a story about Nick Adams going hunting, fishing rather, on the Big Two-Hearted River. And you sense as you read the story that he's trying to recover from something that's never spoken. And as I said, it was a story about coming back from the war that never mentioned the war.
Okay, one more question to your right again.
Whatever happened to your children?
Well, they're all still with us, I'm glad to say. Now, during World War II, Bumby was captured, and I was very concerned about him. He was wounded, but he came through that fine. And now, Patrick and Gregory are the two younger boys, and Gregory I'm very proud of because he is the best shot of all of my three sons. He wins prizes as a marksman. They're doing well, thanks.
All right, let's give a hand to Mr. Ernest Hemingway. And now at this point, I think there might be some questions for our scholar, Mr. John Anderson.
Hi, Ben.
Hang on. Let's have your, so everybody can hear you.
Hemingway seemed to dry up writing in the 1950s.
Yes, and there's been a lot of speculation about that by his many biographers. He did write For Whom the Bell Tolls in 1940, which became a bestseller. And then he had a dry spell. Of course, the war occurred, and he was very active in the war. But as I mentioned, in 1944, he had a traumatic brain injury in that car accident, and it was sort of undiagnosed. He was allowed to leave the hospital and drink heavily, and now subsequent studies have shown that he had a subdural hematoma, and it should have been allowed to, they should have drilled into his skull and released the pressure of that subdural hematoma. And that probably severely affected his brain. And then there were a whole series. He was in a plane crash, 2 plane crashes almost right on top of one another in Africa in 1954. And newspapers published his obituary, which he got a big kick out of reading in the hospital later. But he was severely hurt in that accident. He had a drinking problem. He was diabetic. He had high blood pressure. He just had, a litany of health problems that contributed to his inability to finish work. He wrote voluminously all through the 50s, but he never felt that they were ready for publication. Now, after his death, his estate has published a number of those works, and many critics feel that that's really a disservice to Hemingway because it's not really his best work and was not how he would have wanted people to remember him.
Okay, straight ahead, right? Look straight ahead to us, right back here.
Thank you.
Your Nobel Prize for Literature was awarded for which one of your literary works?
The Nobel Prize is awarded for the body of a writer's work, but it's widely believed that The Old Man and the Sea, which he published in 1952, kind of tipped the scales. Most of his well-known work is in the 20s and 30s, actually the 20s. In Our Time is 1925, Sun Also Rises is 1926, and A Farewell to Arms is 1929. Those are widely believed to be his 3 most significant, innovative books. And then From the Bell Tolls was his big bestseller, and that's 1940. And so he was given the award for the body of his work, but the success of The Old Man and the Sea in 1952 kind of made him a sentimental favorite for the award in 1954.
What was the appeal of Gertrude Stein? She seemed to be a magnet for all of these creative people.
Well, she claimed that she was one of the 2 great geniuses of the 20th century, and she had a decent claim to the fact. She was extremely innovative and very influential, and she had a great eye for discovering important artists and writers, and she mentored Hemingway in many ways. They had a very acrimonious falling out later. She published a very unflattering account of him in her book, The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, and he wrote horrible things about her in return. So actually that's probably the case with most of Hemingway's friendships. They tended to sour at some point. Even F. Scott Fitzgerald was somebody that he ended on not very good terms with, and Fitzgerald basically found him his publisher, Scribner's, and was very instrumental in his success. I'll let you decide.
Did they ever find the manuscripts that were stolen in the suitcase?
Never did. And there's been a lot of speculation. A lot of writers have invented scenarios. There's a book I was talking to Mary McDonald about called Appropriating Hemingway, and it has a chapter that's about all the novels that people have written imagining what might have happened to those manuscripts. And there's even a very new one that's about to come out called The Hemingway Valise by Robert Owen Butler, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning writer. So the speculation continues.
One right here.
Did Hemingway move to Key West?
He moved to Key West with his second wife, Pauline, in around the late 20s, they came back to America from France in 1929. She was from Piggott, Arkansas, and they were spending time in Piggott when he was finishing A Farewell to Arms. And about that time, they started exploring Key West.
Okay, well, time for one more question right over to your right.
Was it just a accumulation of a lot of things in his life, depression or whatever, that brought him to his eventual end?
Well, there was a strain of suicide in his family. His father had committed suicide in 1928, and two of his siblings ultimately would also commit suicide, and a third one is suspected of being a suicide. And of course, his granddaughter Margot committed suicide. And so there's a genetic predisposition, you might argue, for depression and bipolar disorder and suicide. But it hit him very hard at the end of his life when he was undergoing electroshock therapy, and it obliterated his memory and his ability to write. John F. Kennedy asked him to write a single sentence in some kind of official commemorative document. He couldn't write a sentence. And that was just a few months before he committed suicide. And he tried a few times before he succeeded. His wife felt that he should not have been allowed to leave the Mayo Clinic, but he was a good actor, and he convinced the doctors he was better, and he went home to Idaho, and that's where he committed suicide.
All right. Good questions. Thank you to John Anderson.